They won't take your freedom by force. They'll give you entertainment, comfort, and dopamine. And before you realize it, you'll hand over everything, willingly. That's the quiet dystopia Aldous Huxley warned us about. A future where no one is openly oppressed, but everyone is numb. Where truth doesn't matter as long as you feel good. Where pain disappears, and along with it, critical thinking, freedom, and real love. Huxley didn't just write science fiction. He wrote a mirror of our present. And in this video, we're going to explore one of the darkest, most visionary warnings in modern philosophy. When pleasure becomes an illusion, and control disguises itself as freedom. If you think you're in control, you might just be too comfortable to notice the cage. Imagine a world where freedom isn't taken by force, but gently replaced with comfort. Where a baby's crying isn't soothed with care, but with conditioning. Where pleasure isn't a choice, but a program. Aldous Huxley showed this reality with surgical precision in Brave New World, a shocking portrait of a society that learned how to manipulate its citizens from the cradle, training them to love their own servitude. In Huxley's world, conditioning literally starts in childhood, inside incubation centers. Babies are no longer born from mothers, but from machines. The natural bond is cut. Instead of a warm embrace, there is control. The state, represented by the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, teaches what must be loved and hated, what is pleasant and what is repulsive, using classic conditioning methods similar to Pavlov and Skinner. One of the most striking scenes in the novel is when delta-cast babies are placed in front of flowers and books. When they try to touch them, they receive electric shocks and hear terrifying noises. The result? They grow up hating nature and books. Why? Because natural contemplation and critical reading don't serve the state. They're useless. They don't drive consumption. They don't produce stability. This shows us that pleasure, what many people today would call a positive experience, is carefully redirected and domesticated to serve the interests of the dominant structure. Hedonism isn't free, it's shaped. Pleasure, which should be an expression of freedom, becomes a tool of control. Huxley warns us, a government won't need to rule through pain if it can program pleasure efficiently. The new tyrant doesn't dress like a dictator. He shows up as a manager of well-being, and the people, instead of resisting, feel grateful. This critique of comfort culture has become disturbingly relevant. From childhood, we are surrounded by quick rewards. The education system, marketing, media, even electronic toys and social media algorithms work in a way that resembles the conditioning in the novel. They train us to want what keeps us dependent and obedient. When we treat suffering as unacceptable and pleasure as the ultimate goal, we create a generation that never learned how to deal with discomfort, physical, emotional, existential, and even worse, a generation that can't question what it wants because its desires were programmed early on. As Huxley wrote, they're conditioned not to think, conditioned to consume, conditioned to be happy with their caste, conditioned to love what they have and despise what they don't have. Brave New World. This kind of happiness isn't virtue, it's anesthesia. In ancient Greece, Epicurus taught that true pleasure comes from moderation and inner freedom. Huxley, however, shows a modern paradox, hedonism as a form of prison. Not a prison of bars, but a prison of stimulation. In the society of the novel, the search for pleasure isn't a path to self-discovery. It's a distraction from consciousness. There is no thinking, no suffering, no choosing, only reacting. Pleasure becomes a conditioned reflex, mechanical, predictable, harmless. And this idea feels current. Just look at how much kids' entertainment is built on non-stop visual and sound stimulation. From early on, children are exposed to sensory experiences that weaken concentration and introspection. Instant pleasure replaces the development of critical thinking. Like the citizens of Brave New World, they learn early to avoid boredom, silence, and solitude, exactly the conditions needed to form deep awareness. Instead of asking, What do I really want? They start asking, what feels good right now? Huxley's system is clever because it teaches not only what people should do, but what they should desire. Hedonistic conditioning creates citizens who love consumption, hate nature, feel disgust toward deep reading, abstract thinking, and pain. And more than that, all of it feels completely natural to them. As Mustafa Mond, one of the world controllers, explains, happiness is mandatory, unhappiness is abnormal, pain is unnecessary. It's a civilization where everyone chooses what the system already decided for them. That's the genius of conditioning. There's no obvious coercion, only early adaptation. No need for violence, only emotional training from the cradle. Applied to our world, Huxley forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Are we really choosing what we desire? How many of our pleasures are spontaneous, and how many were conditioned? Are our children being taught to think, or just to respond? What we see today isn't very different. Kids with unrestricted access to digital devices, constantly fed rewards, bombarded with stimulation that keeps them busy, happy, and most importantly, manageable. The most devastating part of Huxley's critique is this. By conditioning pleasure, society doesn't erase freedom in an authoritarian way. It makes freedom feel unnecessary. No one misses what they never experienced. If everyone believes they're happy, why would they change? That's the trick of hedonistic conditioning. It's not enough to impose what must be done. You have to teach people to love the imposition. This creates a human being who looks satisfied, but is deeply alienated from themselves. Huxley anticipates a future where control doesn't require violence, only emotional engineering. People stop searching for truth because truth is uncomfortable. They choose predictable pleasure over uncertain freedom. Desire becomes a script, not a discovery. Education or training. One of the most unsettling parts of Brave New World is that conditioning from childhood isn't seen as cruelty, but as social efficiency. Everyone's happiness is guaranteed, but is that happiness real? If a child learns from a young age to run from anything uncomfortable, they may become highly functional, but deeply fragile. Society produces consumers, not thinkers. And when pleasure becomes the only value, any kind of pain, even the pain of growth, doubt, and frustration, is eliminated. Aristotle taught that virtue is built through habit, but also through struggle. Character is formed in the tension between desire and reason. By replacing that process with constant pleasant stimulation, hedonistic conditioning blocks moral and existential maturity. So we don't create individuals, we create copies. And as Huxley said, uniformity is perfection. Brave New World. But do we want to be perfect or free? Do you believe we're being conditioned from childhood to desire what makes us submissive? Have you ever stopped to ask how many of your desires are truly yours? We live in an era where feeling good has become an expectation. There's something strange about that, when the search for pleasure stops being a natural part of life and becomes life's main goal. In The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley offers a radical and unsettling insight. Pleasure can become a way to escape, not only from pain, but from reality itself. As he describes his experience with mescaline, Huxley realizes that our everyday perception of the world is actually limited, almost like we're always looking at reality through narrow cracks. The human mind, he suggests, works like a reducing valve, filtering out overwhelming information and giving us only what we can handle. But what happens when we try to avoid even that small portion of reality? What happens when we seek pleasure not as a way to truly live, but as a form of anesthesia? Huxley observes that many people turn to pleasure through drugs, entertainment, shopping, or shallow relationships, not to expand consciousness, but to silence it. And here's the key point. When pleasure becomes a psychological drug, it stops being freeing. It becomes avoidance, a refined form of denial. Most people live their lives in a kind of semi-consciousness, a mechanical routine in which little is noticed and even less is understood. The Doors of Perception. In that state, pleasure turns into a prison. It creates a numbing comfort zone where there's no space to face what's real: pain, emptiness, time, mortality, existential anxiety. And it's exactly in those confrontations that our awareness grows. The existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard anticipated this when he said, "Modern man is always trying to escape the despair of being oneself." And in Huxley's view, that escape is often disguised by pleasures that society approves of, from endless entertainment to the spiritualized use of substances. In The Doors of Perception, Huxley tries to explore whether altered states of consciousness can bring us closer to a deeper experience of reality. And he does it with philosophical seriousness. But even in this experiment, he warns, there's a thin line between expanding perception and running away from responsibility. Not every high is liberating. Many times, pleasure puts us inside a bubble that makes the world easier to swallow, but less true. Ecstasy can be a doorway or a cage. And this is one of Huxley's deepest critiques of modern society. Our culture has turned pleasure into a disguise for emptiness, a sophisticated comfort, like a drug that keeps us from looking inward, or from staring into the abyss outside of us. Reality, in its raw and naked form, is often avoided, and in its place, we consume simulations of experience, the doors of perception. Technology, advertising, emotional addictions, social media. All of it offers forms of pleasure that feel like real experiences, but actually pull us away from full perception. Pleasure becomes not a means, but a mechanism for avoidance. And this isn't limited to chemical or spiritual states. Huxley predicted with precision what we now call the culture of constant entertainment. We are surrounded by distractions, series, short videos, music, memes, aggressive advertising, promising instant relief, but making us incapable of facing inner silence. That need for distraction is really a form of existential panic. The inability to be alone, without stimulation, reveals how dependent we've become on pleasant sensations just to hold our identity together. Just look at one disturbing fact: the explosive rise of behavioral addictions among children and teenagers. Addiction to screens, games, social media. Constant pleasure blocks the development of a strong inner foundation. It teaches them to avoid boredom, frustration, waiting, and above all, self-knowledge. As Huxley suggests, many people no longer want to face what's real. They want to stay in a constant state of stimulation, even if it separates them from deeper reality. Huxley isn't a moralist who condemns pleasure. Not at all. He recognizes its spiritual, aesthetic, and even mystical value. But he warns, when pleasure is used to escape reality, it becomes the enemy of wisdom. And here it's worth remembering the Buddha's teaching. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Huxley might add, running from pain can steal our maturity, because it's through facing pain that we discover who we are. It's in discomfort that the truth of human experience shows itself. In a society that medicalizes every kind of sadness, that turns any discomfort into a disorder, and offers chemical or digital solutions for the smallest sign of anxiety, pleasure becomes a compulsive act of denial. The title, The Doors of Perception, comes from a line by William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. But if, instead of cleansing those doors, we just decorate them with pleasant sensations, we lose depth. Misguided pleasure turns those doors into display windows, beautiful but sealed. We stay outside reality, admiring comforting reflections, never crossing to the other side. Huxley invites us to be suspicious of what feels too easy, to distrust happiness sold in pills, spirituality packaged as weekend experiences, wisdom reduced to motivational quotes. As enjoyable as all that may be, it can also be keeping us away from real life. Avoiding reality has a cost, the loss of meaning. As Viktor Frankl pointed out, human beings don't live on pleasure alone. They live on meaning, and when pleasure is used as anesthesia, it blocks pain. But it also blocks depth, real love, commitment, and transcendence. The more we avoid reality, the more shallow we become. And the more shallow we become, the more dependent we are on stimulation. Paraphrasing Huxley, that vicious spiral pushes us toward emptiness, an emptiness we try to fill with even more pleasure, and the cycle repeats. But deep down, what we're looking for isn't pleasure, it's presence. Pleasure can come along with that presence, but it can't replace it. We live in a time when consciousness, instead of being nurtured, is quietly collapsing. Surrounded by screens, sounds, colours, promises, and instant pleasure, we're bombarded by non-stop stimulation. And in the process, we lose our most essential habit, reflection. Aldous Huxley, in one of his lesser-known and deeply unsettling works, Ape and Essence, warns with striking clarity about what we could call sensory overload, a toxic buildup of stimulation that poisons the mind, numbs the soul, and makes us strangers to ourselves. In this book, published in 1948, after the horrors of World War II and under the growing fear of nuclear war, Huxley imagines a post-apocalyptic world where humanity, after destroying itself with bombs, tries to start over. But even in that devastated setting, old habits survive: the worship of technology, brute force, and superficiality. Everything remains, like a disease that outlives the body. The problem Huxley points to is profound. Even after catastrophe, human beings don't change because they've lost the ability to look inward. They can no longer learn from pain. And why? Because they've been overstimulated to exhaustion. There's no inner silence left, no space for consciousness to grow. Today, we live in an era of excess. Information, entertainment, images, products, options. We absorb more data in a single day than the average person in the 19th century would receive in an entire lifetime. And that avalanche of stimulation, which looks like freedom, is actually a barrier to deep reflection. Huxley anticipates this with unsettling precision. In Ape and Essence, he shows a civilization that survived physically but died spiritually. The intellect is twisted, language is degraded, religious rituals are distorted. Technical progress continues, but human beings become incapable of looking within. Introspection requires silence, and the modern world runs on noise. Ape and Essence. The human mind wasn't built for constant overexposure. Attention, memory, concentration, these mental functions depend on pauses, on unfilled time, on creative emptiness. But in a society that never stops stimulating us, there's no room for doubt, regret, or contemplation. And without those, there's no real awareness, only reaction. In his critique, Huxley goes beyond psychology. He understands that overstimulation isn't an accident. It's a subtle form of domination. Instead of controlling the masses through violence, the system keeps them busy, distracted, and satisfied with quick pleasures. A kind of control that doesn't use chains, but screens, music, alerts, and instant rewards. This idea echoes philosophers like Guy Debord with his concept of the society of the spectacle, and Neil Postman in Amusing Ourselves to Death. Both argue that modern civilization isn't being oppressed by pain, it's being suffocated by entertainment. Excess stimulation fragments the mind, destroys depth, and turns the citizen into a consumer. Huxley, with his sharp irony, shows this in Ape and Essence through the grotesque. The new society that rises after destruction is ruled by absurd rituals and twisted religious ideas, where thought is replaced by automatic behavior. The human essence is lost because consciousness is lost, and consciousness is lost because it has been replaced by non-stop stimulation. The real tragedy Huxley points to isn't the end of the physical world, but the end of the inner world. The human mind, once capable of creating culture, philosophy, and spirituality, falls into a kind of coma. There are no more questions, only pre-packaged answers. No more creative anguish, only constant dopamine. This critique is even more urgent today. We live in a moment where attention has become a commodity. Social media fights for our focus. Each notification is a small hit of pleasure. Each image is a potential click. The world has been gamified, but the cost is the decline of critical awareness. That's why Huxley didn't see censorship as the biggest danger. The real threat is irrelevant overload. When everything demands your attention, nothing feels meaningful. When everything is noise, truth isn't denied, it's ignored. You don't have to burn books. You just have to make people stop reading them. Brave New World Revisited. Huxley had a deep connection to spiritual traditions, especially Vedanta and Christian mysticism. He believed expanding consciousness was possible, but it required inner discipline, contemplation, and silence. That's why the stimulated world in Ape and Essence is also a world without a soul. The religion that remains is cartoonish, mechanical, grotesque. Spiritual essence is replaced by meaningless ritual, because there's no depth left. And without depth, everything becomes surface. Faith, ethics, love, thought. Today we see the same pattern. Spirituality sold like a product, transcendence packaged as an app, meditation turned into a productivity tool. Everything fast, light, pleasant, and shallow. Excess stimulation doesn't just destroy introspection, it cheapens what is sacred. It turns mystical experience into another commodity. Without introspection, there is no regret. Without regret, there is no learning. Without learning, there is no growth. Human beings, with no awareness of themselves, repeat old mistakes with new technology. And that's what Huxley shows so brutally. Even after the world ends, people keep acting the same way, like robots guided by primitive impulses. Man is the animal that trips over the same stone twice and calls it destiny. Ape and Essence. Civilization keeps stimulating us, but it doesn't educate us. It informs, but it doesn't shape us. The result is a hyper-connected society that is emotionally illiterate, quick to react, slow to understand, eager to consume, unable to transform. Without awareness, there is no real freedom, only programmed choices. And without freedom, the human being fades away, replaced by something functional but empty. We tend to believe, almost innocently, that technology is a neutral tool and that its value depends only on how we use it. But in Brave New World Revisited, Aldous Huxley dismantles that illusion with surgical precision. For him, modern technology isn't just a set of tools, it's a conditioning system, a channel through which pleasure is delivered to shape human experience, maintain social stability, and, most dangerously, shut down inner freedom. We live in an era where technology stopped serving life and started redefining it. It shapes our time, our emotions, our thinking, and even our most private desires. And it doesn't do this through visible oppression, but through something more subtle: pleasure. Constant, shallow, convenient pleasure that looks like freedom but works like a tool of conformity. In Brave New World, technology is fully tied to biopower. It's not just useful, it produces happiness on demand. The most symbolic example is Soma, the perfect drug. No hangover, no guilt, no reflection. One dose is enough to erase any existential discomfort. Soma isn't a vague metaphor. It represents all the technological escapes we give ourselves so we don't have to face reality. Today, it's not just drugs. It's social media, streaming, augmented reality, personalized algorithms, entertainment apps, instant porn, artificial dopamine. Each of these becomes a modern form of Soma. No effort, no thinking, and the system keeps running exactly as it is. As Huxley warns in his later work, new technologies will make it possible for governments to get people to love their servitude. Brave New World Revisited. And how is that love created? Through pleasure. Technology provides pleasure that is planned, safe, and measurable. It doesn't just satisfy desires, it manufactures them. The original promise of technology was to expand what we could do. But what happens when it starts deciding what we should want? Huxley is relentless in showing how technology doesn't just fulfill human wants, it creates a whole new structure of needs. We're surrounded by systems that tell us what to watch, what to buy, what to think, what to feel. Platform algorithms act like small engineers of desire. They measure our behavior and feed back a version of the world that keeps our impulses circulating, always within predictable limits. The philosopher Herbert Marcuse, a contemporary of Huxley, called this repressive desublimation. The system allows certain pleasures, but only the ones that keep people obedient, productive, and predictable. There's no direct censorship, but there is a flood of distraction. Technology does this perfectly. It offers relief, but not transformation. Real freedom is wanting what you choose, not choosing between desires that were manufactured. Brave New World Revisited. We've never been more connected and never felt more alone. Technology links us through networks, but it pulls us away from real experience. Touch becomes an emoji. Conversation becomes a text. Meeting becomes a video call. And introspection becomes a notification we ignore. This shift isn't neutral. Huxley understood that long before the digital age. For him, technology doesn't erase humanity. It reshapes it to fit better into the logic of efficiency and consumption. And that's how real experiences get replaced by simulations. In Brave New World, emotional relationships are disposable. Love is dangerous because it demands depth, risk, and suffering, everything the system wants to avoid. Instead, it offers simplified emotional technology, sex without bonds, constant entertainment, and programmed highs. Technology protects people from pain, and as a result, blocks maturity. Today, that reality is right in front of us. Apps replacing face-to-face connection, platforms monetizing affection, AIs offering companionship. Everything practical, clean, controlled, yet deeply empty. Huxley goes beyond cultural criticism. He exposes the political project built into technology. Shallow pleasure isn't an accident. It's a strategy of power. A population that is satisfied, stimulated, and distracted is a population that doesn't question. The most unsettling part is that this kind of control doesn't feel oppressive. It feels desirable. People accept digital surveillance, data collection, and algorithm-driven behavior patterns in exchange for convenience and pleasure. In Brave New World Revisited, Huxley argues that the dictatorships of the future wouldn't look like the dictatorships of the past. They wouldn't need guns, censorship, or concentration camps. It would be enough to keep everyone happy enough not to care. The perfect dictatorship will have the appearance of democracy. A prison without walls in which the prisoners will not even dream of escaping. Brave New World Revisited. That's the essence of control through pleasure. You don't have to ban critical thinking. You just have to make it feel irrelevant. The final result of this model is a humanity that doesn't suffer and therefore doesn't learn. Technology blocks pain, and with it blocks reflection, transformation, and wisdom. Fast pleasure protects us from discomfort, but it also makes us shallow. Pain, in the philosophical sense, is what forces us to question, to search for meaning, to break inertia. Without it, there's no growth. And when technology becomes a distributor of pleasure, it acts like a shield against existential discomfort. Huxley warns us, a civilization that removes pain also removes the ability to transcend. It creates people who are satisfied, but never virtuous, busy, but never awake, stimulated, but never truly aware. Huxley's critique isn't a call to go back to some primitive life. He wasn't against technology itself, but against using it as a tool for collective numbness. The key question he leaves us is technology serving us or shaping us? Using technology ethically requires awareness. It requires discomfort. It requires limits. It means recovering silence in the middle of noise, presence in the middle of distraction, depth in the middle of speed. Technology can be liberating, but only if it's used with critical thinking and conscious intention. When it becomes just a channel for pleasure, it loses its dignity and turns into an extension of addiction. And you? Has technology expanded your freedom, or is it simply offering you easy comfort? You can cross borders, say whatever you want online, wear what you want, buy and sell, protest in the streets. And still, you can remain a prisoner not of bars or governments, but of yourself. In the perennial philosophy, Aldous Huxley warns us about something most people don't want to face. Real freedom isn't something you win on the outside. It's something you build on the inside. Being politically free isn't enough. You also have to be spiritually free. And contrary to what modern culture keeps selling us, doesn't come from more pleasure. It comes from more awareness, more inner control, more silence, and more discipline. For Huxley, the biggest enemy of inner freedom isn't fear or obvious authoritarianism. It's pleasure used the wrong way. Pleasure that slowly poisons the soul. The kind of pleasure that gets us drunk on comfort, makes us dependent on constant stimulation, and keeps us from seeing who we really are. Modern life built an idea of freedom around satisfying desires. Freedom became a synonym for choice, but Huxley pushes back hard on that. He shows that having choices doesn't automatically mean you're free, especially when those choices are shaped by conditioned impulses and desires you don't even understand. The man who is a slave to his appetites, who chases pleasure non-stop, is no freer than the prisoner in his cell, the perennial philosophy. The real issue, Huxley says, isn't that we have desires. It's that we don't know where they come from or where they're taking us. We get carried by our urges like leaves in the wind. And modern culture, built on consumption and distraction, encourages exactly that inner confusion. Outer freedom becomes a mask. On the surface, the person looks free, but inside they live like an automaton, conditioned, stimulated, and constantly running from themselves. Huxley returns to an idea found in many mystical and ascetic traditions. The more we chase pleasure as the ultimate goal, the more we become its slave. Pleasure isn't evil by itself, but when it turns into an emotional and psychological addiction, it traps the mind in repeating cycles and blocks real inner growth. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said, "What enslaves a man isn't things themselves, but his dependence on them." Huxley echoes that wisdom as he looks at the 20th century, and by extension, our own time. He points out that modern people were trained to fear suffering and worship comfort so deeply that they'll accept almost any system that promises non-stop pleasure, even if it costs them truth or deeper freedom. In that logic, pleasure becomes a new kind of oppression, not forced from outside, but desired from within. The soul needs discipline, silence, and contemplation, but a pleasure-driven culture teaches that any discomfort is unbearable, and so the spirit never matures. The perennial philosophy. Unlike the quick promises of a pleasure-obsessed society, inner freedom requires patient work on yourself. Huxley draws from Vedanta, mystical Christianity, and Buddhism to show that spiritual self-mastery doesn't happen by accident. It comes from learning to watch your own thoughts, rein in your impulses, and accept suffering as part of waking up. That discipline isn't repression. It's clarity. It's realizing that not everything you want is good for you. It's being able to say no to a momentary urge so you can say yes to something higher. It's understanding that pleasure is only one part of life, and living only for it means losing what matters most. In that sense, inner freedom isn't freedom to do whatever you feel like doing. It's freedom from being dragged around by every desire that shows up. It's the ability to choose truth even when it hurts, instead of the illusion that feels good. Huxley believes the great spiritual traditions weren't created to deny life, but to guide human beings toward this deeper freedom. And what they all share is the value of self-knowledge, contemplation, and moderation. In the perennial philosophy, he writes, "Liberation doesn't come from multiplying pleasures, but from recognizing the illusory nature of the ego and uniting with ultimate reality." In other words, inner freedom is also freedom from the ego, the small conditioned self that feeds on pleasure and distraction. It's the freedom to not be trapped inside your own mind. That liberation is what mystics called enlightenment, awakening, union with the divine. But in the modern world, those practices often get replaced by easier promises, shallow self-help, fast consumption spirituality, artificial transcendent experiences. The search for inner discipline gets swapped for wellness techniques designed to avoid discomfort. And the result is a generation that wants to feel good, but doesn't know who it is. Huxley isn't against political freedom or civil rights. Not at all. He values them. But he argues that without inner freedom as a foundation, those rights can become empty. Outer freedom allows you to act. Inner freedom allows you to act with awareness. A society that values only outer freedom ends up producing people who are confused, anxious, pleasure-driven, and easy to manipulate, because they have no inner roots, no center, no clear sense of their own values. And in that state, they're an easy target for any system that promises pleasure, stability, or success. That's why, in his work, Huxley warns that the greatest threat to freedom isn't open tyranny. It's hypnotic comfort. We don't need a tyrant who crushes us. We only need a system that entertains us. And while we're distracted, we become blind to the slavery we build inside ourselves. Huxley's message is, above all, a call to courage. In a world offering non-stop pleasure and endless distraction, choosing inner freedom is an act of spiritual rebellion. It means choosing to stop, to be quiet, to observe, to reflect, to feel pain, doubt, and restlessness, without running away. It means a life with fewer impulses, but more presence, less comfort, but more truth, less instant gratification, but more meaning. Self-mastery is the first step toward wisdom, and wisdom is the only freedom that cannot be taken away. The perennial philosophy. In a time when everything can be sold, from the body to attention, from truth to faith, one last frontier is starting to be taken over by the market, consciousness itself. And as Aldous Huxley shows in The Devils of Loudun, when the sacred becomes a spectacle and the spiritual gets reduced to performance, what once could free a human being can end up trapping them in an even subtler way. At first glance, the book looks like a historical study about demonic possession in a French convent in the 1600s. But underneath, it's a sharp critique of how power, faith, and desire get tangled together to control people's minds. Huxley shows that even in a deeply religious era, spirituality could already be used as a tool for mass manipulation. And he goes further. He clearly anticipates something we see everywhere today, the selling of spiritual experience as a market product. In The Devils of Loudun, Huxley tells the real story of Father Urbain Grandier, accused of witchcraft and eventually executed. But the case is full of political schemes, collective hysteria, and a public atmosphere where religion becomes entertainment. The possessions of the nuns turn into an event. Spirituality becomes a stage. Sacred drama turns into a tool for domination and distraction. And what seems historically distant becomes painfully familiar today. Many inner experiences that once belonged to silence, doubt, deep searching, and the lonely path of the soul have been turned into consumer packages. Spiritual retreats sold like luxury tourism. Meditation turned into an app. Expanded consciousness sold like a lifestyle. Religion, like eroticism, can be manipulated to entertain the masses and at the same time control them. The Devils of Loudun. Huxley warns that when the spirit is forced into the logic of consumption, it loses its power to transform. Instead of creating real inner conflict, it offers comfort. Instead of producing awakening, it sells relief. And what was meant to be a path of self-knowledge becomes a form of spiritual entertainment. One of the most subtle distortions of modern life is this. We've been trained to want higher experiences without doing any real inner rising. We can buy self-knowledge courses, mystical experiences, alternative therapies, ancient techniques, all wrapped in a Zen, minimalist, Instagram-ready aesthetic. But a lot of it is just emotional pleasure wearing a spiritual mask. This is where Huxley's critique goes deeper. He understands that real spiritual experience is often uncomfortable. It forces us to look inward, face our conflicts, our fears, our own shadow. But the market needs to sell what feels good, not what changes you. So the spirituality that sells is the kind that doesn't demand a new life, sacrifice, real silence, or real transformation. The spirit was reduced to a feeling, truth to a performance, consciousness to a product. The devils of Loudun. And that creates a paradox. The more we consume spiritual experiences, the farther we get from genuine spirituality, because genuine spirituality takes depth, time, emptiness, and listening. All the things the market treats as unprofitable. We live in an age where there's a market for everything, and spirituality has become one of the most profitable industries. If Huxley were alive, he wouldn't be shocked. He already knew that where there's desire, there's manipulation. And the desire for transcendence, one of the deepest human desires, is being exploited with real skill. There are digital gurus with millions of followers, overpriced awakening courses, products promising instant emotional healing, spiritual marketing filled with empowering language and seductive slogans. But what's being sold most of the time isn't real awareness. It's anesthesia disguised as enlightenment. This commodification of consciousness has a double effect. It cheapens the sacred and neutralizes its critical power. Inner experience, something that should confront us with truth and push us out of our comfort zone, gets turned into yet another comfort tool. And the system keeps running, now filled with conscious consumers who are still perfectly adjusted to the status quo. In The Devils of Loudun, Huxley shows how spiritual manifestations were shaped to serve the interests of religious and political authorities of that time. Mystical content got distorted, and the collective experience got guided and controlled. The same thing happens today. Spiritual content is stripped of its radical edge and turned into something light, pleasant, and shareable. But spirituality, without crisis, without silence, without pain, and without transcendence, is just a simulation. And as Baudrillard would say, simulation can be worse than a lie. It erases the difference between what's real and what's fake, leaving us with no clear standard. The spiritual commodity replaces the call of the spirit. The search becomes a product. Revelation becomes a script. Critical reading of Huxley. Even though Huxley was deeply interested in spiritual traditions, he never romanticized institutional religion. He knew real spiritual awareness is subversive because it challenges a world built on pride, consumption, competition, and ego. When consciousness becomes a commodity, it doesn't transform anymore. It distracts. And a distracted human being isn't a threat to the system. They're useful. There's another key point in Huxley's thinking. When a symbol is authentic, it connects the visible to the invisible. But when a symbol becomes a product, it stops pointing to mystery and starts pointing back to itself. That's exactly what happens with commodified spirituality. Rituals don't lead us deeper anymore. They just lead to more experiences. The symbolism gets stylized, removed from context, and sold. Everything looks beautiful, but feels empty. Strong, but shallow. Just like the possessed nuns in The Devils of Loudun played a social role, often without fully realizing how they were being used. We also act out modern rituals without noticing they're pre-made scripts designed for emotional consumption, not transcendence. Huxley doesn't end in despair. His view, even when brutal, is also an invitation to clarity. He asks us to recognize the illusion, reject comfortable simulation, and seek a real inner life, even if it costs us pleasure, social approval, or quick comfort. For him, consciousness can only grow when it stops needing to please, to buy, to perform. We have to make room again for silence, for doubt, for the kind of pain that transforms. We have to recover the sacredness of what can't be seen and resist the temptation to put it up for sale. The spirit can't be packaged, sold, or delivered in 5 business days. It demands surrender. The Devils of Loudun. No one will need to gag us, or lock us up, or forbid us from thinking. In modern society, the truth won't be hidden by force anymore. It will be ignored by free choice. That's one of Aldous Huxley's most unsettling ideas in Brave New World Revisited. Freedom is threatened not only by authoritarian regimes, but by our own willingness to trade clarity for comfort. Huxley imagined a future where people wouldn't need to be censored. They would choose to numb themselves, and more than that, they would choose not to see. The blindness of contemporary society isn't imposed, it's wanted. It's voluntary blindness. People will love their servitude. That line has become one of the most prophetic of the 20th century. And today, in the 21st, it hits even harder. Faced with an overload of information, easy comfort, and endless distractions, the desire for truth, depth, and responsibility gets replaced by something easier, the entertainment of ignorance. Comfort culture teaches us it's better to feel good than to be aware. Discomfort, conflict, doubt, everything that comes with a lucid, authentic life is avoided with surgical precision. If something makes us uncomfortable, we change the channel. If information challenges us, we label it negative. If a thought demands real change, we reach for distraction. So modern blindness isn't the result of coercion. It's an emotional choice, often unconscious and also collective. It's not just one person refusing to see, but an entire culture that trains us to look at what feels good and ignore what hurts. Huxley understood that, unlike what Orwell suggested in 1984, the danger wouldn't be forbidden truth, but irrelevant truth. In a world flooded with distractions, truth doesn't need to be hidden. It only needs to be drowned out by pleasure, consumption, and spectacle. Truth will be buried under a sea of irrelevance. In a society that rewards appearance, instant gratification, and entertainment, depth becomes a burden. Silence feels scary. Reflection takes effort. Questioning creates instability. And all of that is frowned upon in a culture that demands constant lightness, forced positivity, and emotional productivity. Voluntary blindness shows up, for example, in the way we relate to the biggest crises of our time: inequality, environmental destruction, alienation, collapsing mental health. We know, we have data, we have proof, but we don't want to change, so we choose not to see. Truth hurts, truth demands something, truth forces decisions. So, to protect comfort, we'd rather ignore it. That's the logic Huxley exposes. No one will need to stop us from acting. We will convince ourselves it's not worth acting. Indifference will be dressed up as balance. Omission will be called maturity. Conformity will be sold as inner peace. In Brave New World, Huxley describes a society where people are constantly pushed toward pleasure, and never pain, never frustration, never silence. Everything is designed to block critical thinking. Entertainment never ends. Sex is casual. Relationships are shallow. Culture is watered down. And people love it. There's no tyrant, no obvious censorship, just an irresistible offer of emotional comfort. Those who adapt get rewarded with endless distractions. Those who resist are treated like they're sick. Universal happiness keeps order. Brave New World. This is the core of voluntary blindness. People stop seeing because seeing would mean suffering, and suffering is unacceptable in a hedonistic culture. To see contradictions, injustice, and even our own mistakes would mean breaking with the easy, happy, balanced life sold by ads, digital gurus, and recommendation algorithms. Huxley shows that voluntary blindness is driven by fear. Fear of facing the truth about the human condition. Fear of admitting inner emptiness. Fear of losing privileges. Fear of being wrong. That's why so many cling to simple narratives, comforting slogans, easy explanations. That's why many avoid anything tragic, ambiguous, or spiritually deep. Clarity demands confrontation, and the modern world offers, in exchange, 1,000 instant escape routes: social media, drugs, consumption, entertainment. In one passage of Brave New World Revisited, Huxley writes, "People won't just accept distractions, they'll beg for them." And so blindness becomes an emotional policy, a psychological defense, a mental comfort zone. And what gets lost in all of this is exactly what makes us human. the search for truth, the hunger for meaning, the restlessness of conscience. One of the most devastating parts of modern blindness is that knowledge no longer leads to transformation. We know more than ever, but we do less with it. We have access to books, studies, data, documentaries, courses, and we still stay numb. Because knowledge alone isn't enough. You have to want to see. You have to be willing to leave comfort zones, rethink beliefs, change direction. And in a society built around quick pleasure, that becomes rarer and rarer. The truth that frees us is the same truth that unsettles us. That's why we avoid looking straight at it. And as Huxley argues, our biggest enemy isn't an imposed lie. It's a truth we refuse to face. We don't lack information. We lack the will to see it for what it is. Huxley's work isn't just criticism. It's also a call for courage. The courage to open your eyes when everyone else prefers to sleep. The courage to be quiet when the world is screaming. The courage to seek what's real, even when it hurts. Resisting voluntary blindness isn't easy. It means living with more awareness, which often means carrying more weight, more doubt, more clarity, and less instant comfort. But that's the price of real freedom. The real revolution, in Huxley's view, won't come from the streets or from machines, but from inner awakening. It will come from those who refuse to be carried along by passive entertainment, emotional conformity, and prepackaged thinking. Voluntary blindness isn't permanent. It can be broken, but only by those who choose to see, even when what they see is uncomfortable. And that's Huxley's final point, or the starting point. Freedom begins the moment someone chooses truth, even if it hurts. Awareness is the only antidote to servitude. Brave new world. For thousands of years, spiritual seeking has been shaped by silence, renunciation, and contemplation. The great teachers of tradition, Buddha, Jesus, Laozi, Christian mystics, and Sufi masters, all pointed to the same direction. Turn inward, discipline desire, and loosen your grip on passing pleasures in the name of something far higher. Ultimate truth, the sacred, the divine. But as Aldous Huxley shows in books like The Perennial Philosophy and Brave New World Revisited, modern societies have drifted away from that path. In the name of progress, consumption, and hedonistic freedom, we've stepped away from contemplative traditions and plunged into a culture where pleasure has become the new absolute. Huxley doesn't condemn pleasure itself. What he exposes is the way pleasure has been turned into a spiritual substitute, a fake version of the sacred. Where there used to be a call to transcendence, there's now an offer of comfort. Where there used to be silence, there's stimulation. Where there used to be discipline, there's indulgence. Spiritual tradition has always understood that the path to the sacred requires inner emptiness. The noise of the senses has to quiet down so the soul can hear the still, small voice, as the prophet Elijah described it. You have to cross the desert of the ego to find the source of life. That's why pleasure was treated with caution in these traditions, not as an enemy, but as a dangerous distraction. Huxley recognizes that principle and shows how modernity abandoned it. Instead of cultivating inner silence, the modern world cultivates constant entertainment. Pleasure has moved in to fill every space, even the spaces that were once reserved for introspection and the sacred. The great mystical traditions require stillness and self-mastery, but contemporary civilization rewards noise and distraction. The perennial philosophy. Spiritual experience has been cheapened, and in many cases pushed aside entirely. Secular life didn't just pull people away from organized religion, it also pulled them away from a spiritual attitude toward life itself. Pleasure took the place of prayer. Instant gratification replaced patient waiting. And in the process, consciousness lost depth. Huxley also notices something even more subtle. In secular societies, pleasure doesn't just compete with the spiritual, it dresses up as spirituality. Today, we live in an era where the sacred is simulated. Quick meditations, on-demand spirituality, hollow rituals, transcendent experiences sold like products. But everything revolves around one goal: feeling good. And feeling good became the new ideal. So spirituality is no longer a journey of self-knowledge, surrender, and inner change. It becomes a tool to reduce stress, improve productivity, and boost self-esteem. Everything must serve the ego. Nothing is allowed to challenge it. The sacred, when filtered through the logic of pleasure, loses its power to transform. The perennial philosophy. For Huxley, this pleasure-centered spirituality is the exact opposite of what mystics across history taught. True traditions never promised pleasure. They promised freedom from illusion. But freedom demands sacrifice. The modern world, meanwhile, demands comfort at any cost. One of the core marks of spiritual traditions is their view of suffering as a teacher. Not that pain should be glorified, but that it's part of the path. Suffering, deep and unavoidable, can purify, reveal, and break the ego's illusions. The pleasure-based society, however, wants to eliminate every form of pain, and to do that, it will do anything: medicate emotions, trivialize death, silence existential emptiness, replace anxiety with stimulation. Hedonistic culture doesn't teach you to live with suffering. It teaches you to avoid it at all costs. Huxley calls this a betrayal of spiritual wisdom. If we eliminate pain, we also eliminate the possibility of transformation. The soul needs friction in order to wake up. The perennial philosophy. Mystical traditions didn't see pain as a curse, but as an opening. Today, by turning pleasure into the highest value, we lose that key. And so people remain immature, emotionally fragile, spiritually scattered. Huxley sees clearly that in secular societies, pleasure takes the place that used to belong to God. It becomes the new absolute. Life is measured not by the value of the soul, but by the number of pleasant experiences. Ethics become relative. Self-mastery gets mocked. Contemplation is treated like a waste of time. This reversal of values makes spiritual tradition feel outdated, or worse, inconvenient, because spiritual teachers have always challenged the ego. They always reminded us we are not the center of the universe, that our desires are not the truth, that life is not built around personal satisfaction. Pleasure worshipped as the ultimate goal doesn't free you, it traps you. It pulls a person away from their origin and their destiny, the perennial philosophy. That's why the great religious traditions, despite often being distorted by institutions, have also been sources of wisdom, resistance, and depth. And that's why, in the modern world, they've been pushed aside, mocked, or turned into products. Pleasure doesn't like competition. Huxley, even as a critic of organized religion, believed in the need for an authentic spiritual path, and he saw contemplative traditions, East and West, as an antidote to modern emptiness. This wasn't about going back to an authoritarian religious past. It was about reconnecting with a dimension of being that pleasure culture tries to hide, the dimension of the soul. He called it the perennial philosophy, a universal spiritual wisdom found across cultures, pointing toward the transcendence of the ego, the unity of being, the discipline of the mind, and deep compassion. This tradition doesn't promise pleasure, it promises meaning. And meaning, unlike pleasure, can't be bought. It requires surrender, it requires humility, it requires walking through pain without running from it. The search for the sacred begins where the search for pleasure ends. The perennial philosophy. The biggest challenge of our era isn't atheism, it's spiritual indifference. It's not the absence of faith, but the replacement of faith with pleasant sensations, and that creates a humanity that is more sensitive to pleasure and less sensitive to the sacred. Huxley calls us to stare into that abyss, to see how the worship of pleasure has pulled us away from our essence, and how, without spiritual roots that nourish the soul, we become a sick civilization, overstimulated, hyper-connected, hyper-consumerist, yet empty, fragile, and lost. Art, from the very beginning, was never meant to be a smooth mirror of reality, or a source of comfort. Its deeper mission has always been to shake us, provoke us, and expand our awareness. True aesthetics, as the Greeks taught, is a path of transformation, an inner jolt that forces us to see the world with new eyes. But in modern societies, as Aldous Huxley warns in Eyeless in Gaza, art has been drained of its revealing power and turned into a product, light, instant pleasure for consumption. Through the life of the main character, Anthony Beavis, an intellectual in crisis, torn between nihilism, spirituality, and a hunger for meaning, Huxley gives us more than a psychological drama. He delivers a sharp critique of cultural decline. He shows that in a civilization built around consumption and distraction, even art, this once sacred space of revelation, gets tamed. What should disturb and transform starts to merely please and entertain. Art has lost its poison. It has become emotional dessert. Eyeless in Gaza, in the original view, found in thinkers like Aristotle, Nietzsche, and the mystics, art isn't here to flatter you, it's here to reveal. A real work of art doesn't calm you down, it unsettles you. It breaks your certainty. It opens questions. It offers beauty, yes, but also discomfort. And that creative discomfort is what pulls us out of daily autopilot. In Eyeless in Gaza, Huxley criticizes how contemporary art has lost that dimension. It stopped being a window into the abyss and became a mirror of vanity. Instead of expanding the inner life, it offers quick catharsis. Instead of creating reflective silence, it generates likes. For Huxley, real beauty is dangerous because it exposes what we are and what we hide. But the system doesn't want that kind of beauty. It wants the kind that sells, the kind that comforts, the kind that confirms what we already think. And so art adapts to the logic of the market and loses its ability to lift us beyond ourselves. Every great art requires you to suffer a little. Eyeless in Gaza. Huxley isn't attacking popular art. He's attacking the reduction of art to consumption. He understands that aesthetics has been taken over by a system that turns everything, including our inner life, into a product. In that system, art has to be fast, easy to understand, marketable, shareable, and above all, pleasant. The result is a shallow aesthetic culture where the value of a work is measured by its ability to generate engagement, not reflection. Beauty becomes consumer beauty. Discomfort is treated like a problem. Silence gets tossed out. Slowness becomes unacceptable. The market doesn't want art, it wants emotional decoration. Eyeless in Gaza, Anthony Beavis represents this conflict. Surrounded by culture, he realizes none of it is changing him. He reads, debates, analyzes, but he doesn't feel pierced by art. Everything is there as knowledge, not as experience. And that gap between art and transformation feeds his existential crisis. Huxley points to another shift too. Art stopped being a bridge between self and other, between the visible and the invisible, and became a reflection of the ego. We live in a deeply narcissistic aesthetic era where we create and consume works that mainly validate who we already are, reinforce our tastes, and protect us from what we don't understand. Aesthetics became affirmation, not confrontation. Art stopped questioning us and started praising us, and that is deadly for the spirit. True art doesn't confirm your view of the world. It dismantles it. Eyeless in Gaza. When everything becomes ego expression, there's no room for mystery, for the sacred, for the abyss. Everything gets chewed up, softened, made easy. Even tragedy gets turned into something pretty, clean and harmless. Huxley sees this emptiness and calls it out. When we turn aesthetics into self-affirmation, we lose the chance to be moved out of ourselves. Another key part of Huxley's critique is the loss of inner time, the time real aesthetic experience requires. Reading a dense novel, quietly looking at a painting, listening to a long symphony, sitting with a poem. These things demand time. They demand attention. They demand a pause from the frantic flow of everyday life. But modern life has erased that time. Hurry killed contemplation. Instant gratification destroyed deep listening. And for art to survive in this new environment, it adapted. It got shorter, simpler, faster. But in that process, it got poorer. The spirit needs slowness to understand, but the market demands speed. Eyeless in Gaza. Beavis, tormented by this acceleration, searches for something deeper, but can't find it. The culture around him is full of signs, but empty of meaning. A sea of images that never touch him, words that don't transform him. And like so many people today, he feels drowned in endless aesthetics, yet spiritually starved. For Huxley, real art is an ally of the spirit. It isn't just beautiful, it's deeply unsettling because it connects us with the invisible, the eternal, the thing that can't be said in everyday language. That's why it matters. It reminds us there's something beyond the surface. He saw art as a path similar to mysticism. Both demand silence, surrender, and openness to the unknown. Both pull us out of ego and place us in front of mystery. But that only happens when art is lived as an experience, not just consumed. Authentic art is a doorway. Market aesthetics is a mirror. Eyeless in Gaza. Huxley isn't telling us to abandon art. The opposite. He's calling for a return to what art is for. To reconnect aesthetics with the essential. To treat art as a tool for awareness, not just pleasure. To make aesthetic experience an act of presence, not distraction. That requires a change in posture. Slow down, go deeper, allow discomfort. Choose works that aren't easy, but that challenge you. Recover inner time and refuse the logic of instant entertainment. As Anthony Beavis moves through his journey in Eyeless in Gaza, he begins to see that his crisis won't be solved by more stimulation. He senses he has to turn inward, and in that movement, art stops being just cultural repertoire and becomes a spiritual shortcut. That's where Huxley shows us that aesthetics doesn't serve the ego, it serves the spirit. Human life has always been marked by three unavoidable mysteries: death, suffering, and emptiness. Facing these abysses has demanded throughout history wisdom, myths, rituals, deep art, and spiritual contemplation. But in the modern world, these riddles weren't solved. They were simply covered up. And as Aldous Huxley warns, the main tool behind this escape isn't repression or ignorance, it's entertainment. In his works, especially Brave New World and Brave New World Revisited, Huxley clearly foresees a civilization of spectacle, a world where mass culture acts like an existential drug, keeping people from confronting mortality, pain, and the lack of meaning. Society no longer denies tragedy, it just covers it with a constant veil of distractions. Men will not be oppressed by pain, but distracted by pleasure. Brave New World. That's the key shift. The numbing of consciousness no longer comes through force, but through overload. And the more distracted we are, the less we think, the less we feel, the less we live with depth. Tragic art, from Sophocles to Shakespeare, from Dostoevsky to Bergman, always had one role: to confront the human being with the fragile condition of existence. It doesn't offer easy answers. It reveals absurdity, loss, contradiction, and the unavoidable pain of being alive. But in the world of entertainment, that kind of confrontation is seen as inconvenient. Sadness becomes a dysfunction. Silence becomes boredom. Pain becomes a flaw. The tragic, something that once educated the soul, gets replaced by the trivial, which only distracts it. We live as though we were immortal, as long as we are sufficiently distracted. Brave New World. Social media, reality shows, endless streaming, games, memes, viral clips. Everything offers a non-stop flow of pleasant stimulation that prevents the pause, the emptiness, the anxiety, and also prevents wisdom. Huxley isn't against entertainment itself. He's warning us about what happens when entertainment becomes our main way of living, replacing thought, contemplation, and the search for meaning. Across spiritual and philosophical traditions, suffering has often been seen as a doorway. Buddha built his path on the recognition of suffering. Jesus carried it all the way to the cross. The Stoics saw it as an opportunity for virtue. But modern life created a culture where pain is intolerable, so it must be erased at any cost. And the solution wasn't ethical, spiritual, or philosophical. It was technical, and above all, aesthetic. We built a world where suffering doesn't have to be faced because it can be forgotten, at least temporarily, through a screen. Give people constant distraction and they will stop questioning everything. Brave New World. In Brave New World, the direct symbol of this is soma, the perfect drug that removes existential discomfort with no apparent side effects. But in real life, soma gets replaced by other numbing agents: TV, phones, advertising, 24/7 entertainment. None of them are evil by themselves, but they create the same result. They pull us away from pain, and with it, away from clarity. There's a kind of misery you don't notice at first, the misery of meaning. Modern life is efficient, comfortable, connected, but for many people it's empty. The lack of purpose, depth, and transcendence is a quiet wound. And to avoid feeling that inner hole, we numb ourselves with daily doses of entertainment. Distraction became a right. Boredom became a crime. Silence became a threat. And the result is a generation that prefers any stimulus, even shallow stimulus, over being alone with its own thoughts. The problem is not that there is no meaning, but that we are too busy to look for it. Brave New World. By replacing emptiness with the trivial, entertainment turns into a tool of spiritual containment. It blocks the question, what's the point? It avoids the discomfort of, who am I? And so consciousness stays on the surface. Functional, productive, but disconnected. Classical tragedy produced catharsis, a cleansing of the soul through aesthetic pain. The viewer left transformed. Art made people face something they might never confront on their own. But today, entertainment doesn't want to cleanse, it wants to please. Art doesn't want to elevate, it wants to hold attention. The algorithmic logic that runs digital platforms selects what creates the fastest pleasure. Tragedy doesn't fit that filter. Work that demands silence, pause, and reflection gets buried. And little by little, we lose the ability to digest complex experiences. A mass culture that survives on distraction doesn't want transforming works. It wants visual addictions. Brave New World. That aesthetic passivity creates existential passivity. Instead of engaging with the world, we absorb whatever gets served to us. More personalized, more constant, more numbing. Huxley sees clearly that entertainment, when used as a shield against suffering, blocks the soul's growth. Pain forces us to mature. It forces us to change. It forces us into hard choices. But constant distraction keeps us in emotional childhood, always chasing the next toy, the next novelty, the next escape. A civilization built on entertainment becomes an immature civilization. It refuses to accept death. It ignores other people's suffering. It laughs at tragedy. And slowly, it loses the capacity for compassion, for moral outrage, for transcendence. Modern man refuses to grow up because growing up implies suffering. Brave New World. Huxley's critique isn't nihilistic. It's an invitation to resist. In a world trying to keep us distracted, thinking becomes a revolutionary act. Choosing silence becomes an act of courage. Refusing compulsive entertainment becomes a sign of maturity. Huxley doesn't call for the end of entertainment, but for bringing it back into life with awareness and limits. We need to recover space for tragedy, for aesthetic pain, for contemplation, for silence. We need to remember that we are mortal, and that this remembrance doesn't destroy us, it humanizes us. To face death is the beginning of all wisdom, the perennial philosophy. How a society can control people without violence, and without us even noticing. When people think about social control, they often picture a boot crushing someone's face, an authoritarian government, surveillance cameras, obvious censorship. But Aldous Huxley, with unsettling clarity, predicted a model that's far more effective, control built on pleasure. A system where you don't need to ban, repress, or punish. You just need to seduce. In Brave New World, Huxley describes a society that looks perfect on the outside. No wars, no diseases, no visible conflicts. Everything runs smoothly. but the cost is invisible. People can no longer truly want anything different. Obedience is guaranteed not by force, but by carefully managed pleasure. People aren't oppressed, they're domesticated, and even more disturbing, they're grateful for it. People will be conditioned to love their servitude in a brave new world. That idea isn't just dystopian fantasy. It became one of the most accurate diagnoses of the modern world. We live in a time where freedom is celebrated, but obedience is built into the system. Rebellion feels outdated, not because everything is fine, but because no one wants to give up comfort to challenge the system. Huxley understood that pleasure, when used as a tool of social engineering, can be more powerful than any police force, because it works directly on desire, and whoever controls desire controls behavior. In Brave New World, from birth, citizens are conditioned to link pleasure with conformity. Games, relationships, leisure, consumption. Everything is designed to keep the individual inside their assigned role without questioning. And if something slips through, there is soma, the perfect drug, removing anxiety, doubt, and discomfort. But what Huxley wrote as fiction is what we now see operating with shocking familiarity. Consumption sold as happiness, constant entertainment as escape from reality, instant gratification as an antidote to critical thinking. You don't need to lock up someone who no longer wants to escape. Brave New World. The greatest victory of this model isn't stopping rebellion. It's preventing rebellion from even being born. And it happens because a pleasure-driven society dissolves, from early on, the foundations that create resistance, discomfort, indignation, moral pain, spiritual restlessness. A society that pushes constant pleasure creates people who can't tolerate frustration, and therefore can't fight what oppresses them. Every revolution requires sacrifice, and sacrifice requires values higher than personal comfort. But if the only value left is pleasure, anything that threatens it feels unbearable. In that sense, Huxley goes further than Orwell. While 1984 imagines a future ruled by fear, Brave New World shows a future tamed by desire. Instead of screams, sighs. Instead of torture, distraction. Instead of resistance, adaptation. A kind of soft totalitarianism. Pleasure, once it becomes a social rule, doesn't just shape behavior, it destroys willpower. The ability to choose, to decide, to resist impulses depends on effort. But a culture that rewards only immediate pleasure produces fragile, reactive, emotionally immature people. That fragility isn't natural, it's manufactured. Through constant stimulation, quick rewards, products that promise total comfort, and a cultural message that treats any pain as a disorder, our willpower slowly gets worn down. Anyone who can't handle discomfort can't handle freedom. Brave New World. And when willpower disappears, obedience takes over. Not because it's forced, but because it feels like the only realistic option. A person trained to give in to every impulse won't have the strength to break from a system that satisfies those impulses. They become a partner in their own servitude. We're surrounded by choices: what to eat, what to watch, what to buy, who to date. But we rarely ask, who designed the options we're given? Who shaped the desires that move us? Huxley points to something crucial. Obedience without force becomes possible when the system shapes not only behavior, but desire itself. You can choose between 1,000 products as long as you keep consuming. You can choose between 1,000 pleasures as long as you never question the structure that provides them. This is the most sophisticated kind of control, turning pleasure into the only horizon. Life stops being a search for truth, justice, or transcendence, and becomes the management of sensations. An emotional pragmatism that makes any search for meaning feel inconvenient. Freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's wanting what is true. A critical reading of Huxley. What makes someone rebel? A discomfort that can't be ignored anymore. an indignation that turns into action, a sense of justice stronger than fear. But in a society where pleasure is delivered in small daily doses, the tension that could spark rebellion gets drained away. You don't need to punish the nonconformist. You just distract them. Give them something that comforts them for a while. Wear down their struggle into exhaustion. Wrap their pain in layers of stimulation. Huxley understood this deeply. Rebellion doesn't disappear through oppression. It disappears through numbness. The revolutionary is replaced by the cynic, the saint by the hedonist, the philosopher by the influencer. Numbing is more effective than punishment, and the greatest tragedy isn't repression, it's forgetting. The major philosophical and spiritual traditions have always warned about how addictive pleasure can be, not as moralism, but as awareness. Repeated pleasure becomes habit. Habit becomes need. Need becomes dependence. Aristotle taught that virtue requires control over impulses. Buddha taught that desire is the root of suffering. Roman Stoicism defended calmness as victory over passion. But modern culture flipped the logic. More pleasure is better. Faster is more effective. Less effort is more desirable. Huxley doesn't deny the value of pleasure. He denies making it absolute. When pleasure becomes the center of life, it turns into a golden cage. And the most frightening part is this: it makes us love the cage. The perfect prison is one you don't want to leave. Brave New World. Huxley's critique doesn't end in pessimism. It's also a call to action. Resistance is possible, but it won't be loud. It will be quiet. It will be the rebuilding of willpower, the recovery of inner life, the return to values deeper than immediate comfort. To resist hedonistic obedience is to start saying no. No to the addiction to constant stimulation. No to the infantilization of desire. No to emotional conformity, and to say yes to freedom, not as a right, but as an inner achievement. It means reclaiming the philosophical spirit, the ethical impulse, the spiritual hunger, everything the system can't sell you. And precisely because it can't be sold, it can set you free. We live in a time when the search for intense, transformative, transcendent experiences has become a market. Expanding consciousness, raising your vibration, altered states of perception, these things are widely sold as promises of personal freedom. But is every peak experience actually liberating? Is every kind of spiritual pleasure real? In The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley gives a powerful warning. Some experiences look like expansion, but they only strengthen the ego. Not every expansion of perception leads to freedom. Some only make the prison bigger. The Doors of Perception. Huxley doesn't speak like a moral preacher. Quite the opposite. He writes as someone who actually experienced non-ordinary states of consciousness, especially through mescaline, a natural psychedelic used in indigenous rituals. His account is detailed, philosophical, and poetic. But what makes it so valuable is that even while he describes the ecstasy, he also questions it. From that experience, he recognizes a crucial difference. Some experiences dissolve the ego, and some only inflate it, and both can feel equally intense. While under mescaline, Huxley describes heightened aesthetic perception. Colors became more vivid. Ordinary objects revealed a kind of transcendent beauty, and the boundary between me and the world seemed to blur. But the most important part of his reflection isn't the sensory experience itself. It's what happens to the center of awareness. My self-identity shrank. I was no longer the usual me. The Doors of Perception. For Huxley, that fading of the ego is one of the clearest signs of real expansion. It's not about feeling more pleasure or feeling more important. It's the opposite, realizing that the individual self is temporary, fragile, and partly an illusion, and that something much bigger, deeper, and quieter exists behind it. But he also sees a danger. The ego can hijack ecstasy. Instead of humility, it can produce spiritual arrogance. Instead of dissolving the self, it can pump it up. In the modern world, there's a rush to reach the expanded state, whether through substances, rituals, shallow meditation, esoteric practices, or even the consumption of art and entertainment. Everything seems to promise a kind of emotional liberation, an elevation. But Huxley warns, not every elevation is an elevation of the spirit. Sometimes it's just pride in a new form. A person can come out of an expanded experience feeling superior, special, more awake than everyone else, when in reality, they've only reinforced a sense of separation. The ego can even use mystical experience to inflate itself, and in doing so, it turns truth into illusion. A critical reading of Huxley. That's the paradox of false expansion. It feels freeing, but it traps you even more inside your own image. Instead of dissolving the self, it glorifies it, and in that process, consciousness doesn't truly widen. It just puts on a different costume. Huxley didn't live to see today's awakening industry, but his reflections predicted it with eerie accuracy. Now, experiences that should be deep and quiet have been turned into high-demand emotional products. Retreats, rituals, psychedelic ceremonies, self-discovery workshops. Many sell the promise of expanding consciousness. But what they deliver is an intense feeling without real transformation. Often, these experiences feed narcissism. I'm special. I accessed the sacred. I woke up before everyone else. The result is a new kind of vanity, wrapped in mystical language. And Huxley pushes us to be honest. Expanding consciousness is not expanding the ego, it's turning it off. Ultimate truth is always an experience of letting go, not self-glorification. The doors of perception. For Huxley, one of the clearest signs of real expansion is the ability to live in silence, inner silence, the quieting of mental noise, the pause of the constant need for instant meaning. There's no urgency to show the experience and no need to convince anyone. There is simply presence. The kind of ecstasy that truly transforms doesn't need to be performed. It creates compassion, not superiority. It connects you to mystery, not to a new spiritual identity. That's why Huxley warns about spiritual inflation, which is common among people who have intense experiences but don't integrate them with emotional maturity and inner discipline. Real expansion doesn't just require feeling something, it requires rebuilding your life in the light of what you saw. Huxley admits that altered states of consciousness, especially those triggered by substances like mescaline, can be gateways to wider realities. But he insists, seeing is not the same as changing. An experience can be real and still produce no lasting shift. So he suggests a strict test. An experience is only liberating if, afterward, the person lives with more clarity, more love, more ethics. Otherwise, it was just an ego trip. True expansion dissolves the ego and awakens compassion. False expansion inflates it and isolates you even more. The doors of perception. A key point in Huxley's thinking is that every expansion of consciousness comes with ethical responsibility. Seeing more should mean acting better. Feeling more should mean serving more. It's not just about having a beautiful experience, but becoming more awake to other people's pain, to the world's beauty, and to the urgency of what's real. When expansion is genuine, it removes you from the center. It places you in relationship. It teaches you to listen. And above all, it exposes the illusion that you own the truth. That's why Huxley's critique of hedonistic spiritual experiences, those that only please the senses and confirm the ego, is also a critique of modern consumer culture's version of transcendence. Expansion becomes a product, and consciousness becomes a narcissistic status symbol. By the end of his book, Huxley does not condemn substances or the search for non-ordinary states of consciousness. But he argues for one essential attitude: discernment. You have to learn the difference between ecstasy that reveals and ecstasy that deceives, between what expands and what only seduces. That discernment doesn't come from how intense the experience was, but from the quality of the change it produces. It's not how much you saw, it's how much you integrated. not how much you felt. It's how much you learned to love. And for that, the ego has to move out of the way. We live in an age where freedom of choice is praised as the ultimate proof of individuality. We choose what to wear, what to eat, what to watch, what to buy, who to date. But are those choices truly ours? Or are we, like Aldous Huxley foresaw in Brave New World, just following a carefully designed pattern where everyone chooses the same thing, wants the same sensations, and rejects anything that feels different? Everyone is happy now. Nakrai, a recurring motto in Brave New World. That line, repeated like a mantra by characters in the novel, reveals the central paradox of Huxley's critique. A society can look happy and still be deeply dehumanized. And what fuels that dehumanization isn't brutal repression, but hedonistic conformity, a way of life built on standardized pleasure, controlled stimulation, and domesticated desires. Huxley understood that pleasure, when carefully managed, can be used not only to satisfy, but to standardize. Pleasure that is manufactured, mass-distributed, and tied to predictable stimuli produces people who look more and more alike. People who think the same way, react the same way, and, most importantly, don't want to step outside the pattern, because the pattern rewards them with pleasure. In Brave New World, that standardization begins at birth. Human beings are produced in labs, divided into castes, and conditioned from childhood to love their social role, their tasks, and their preset pleasures. The idea of being original is treated like a disorder. Wanting something different is seen as subversive. Differences are dangerous. Uniformity is perfection. Brave New World. Standardization through pleasure replaces the need for repression. Nobody has to be forced to obey if they're taught early on that what's allowed is already enough to satisfy every desire. And when everyone's desires line up, people become interchangeable. In this context, dehumanization doesn't come from pain, but from the loss of deep individuality. When pleasure becomes the only measure of value, anything uncomfortable, difficult, strange, or too personal gets thrown out. A hedonistic culture may promise freedom, but it does not tolerate the unique. It demands agreement, emotional smoothness, and matching tastes. That inner space that makes us human, the place where contradictions live, where real questions show up, where trauma sits, where wordless intuition exists, gets muted in the name of a safe happiness. Subjectivity dissolves. In its place comes predictable behavior: consume, smile, stay distracted. This critique becomes even more relevant in the digital world, where algorithms offer us exactly what we want or think we want, where everything is personalized, and yet, paradoxically, everything starts to look the same. Mass hedonism doesn't produce freedom, it produces copies. A critical reading of Brave New World. Hedonistic conformity also works on the emotional level. In a society that glorifies lightness, positivity, and instant happiness, deep emotions become inconvenient. Anger must be contained. Sadness must be medicated. Loneliness must be hidden. So emotions, just like desires, get trained to fit what the system can provide. The result is emotional uniformity. Everyone must be fine. Everyone must be grateful. Everyone must smile and look functional. Suffering, which is a real part of being human, is treated like a personal failure. That standardized emotional culture creates inner alienation. People stop knowing what they truly feel and only know what they're supposed to feel. Emotion becomes performance. Pain becomes taboo. And the soul slowly empties, quietly, softly. Obedience is guaranteed when even feelings are regulated. Brave New World. One of the deepest effects of hedonistic dehumanization is that it makes rebellion almost impossible. Because to rebel, you first have to feel something is wrong. You have to suffer doubt, want something different. Exactly the things a system built on standardized pleasure trains you to avoid. Huxley shows, with unsettling clarity, that the world of Brave New World is stable not because it's fair, but because nobody wants to change it. The pleasure offered is enough to keep minds asleep. And those who don't fit, like the savage, are treated as problems to be fixed or removed. That stability comes at a high price, the destruction of inner life. The soul can't express itself if it disrupts the system's shallow harmony. And rebellion in that world isn't just forbidden, it becomes unthinkable. Another part of Huxley's critique is how hedonistic conformity affects spiritual life. The great contemplative and mystical traditions have always emphasized the inner path. Silence, discipline, and even stepping back from pleasure in order to touch something sacred. But in the modern world, constant pleasure makes the spirit seem irrelevant. Real spirituality requires effort, detachment, patience, emptiness. All of that is the opposite of what the system offers. So hedonistic conformity doesn't just standardize desires and emotions, it erases the hunger for transcendence. The question of meaning gets replaced by distraction. The search for the absolute gets traded for quick experiences. And without spirit, the human being becomes a set of functions adjusted to permitted pleasure. Work, consume, have fun, reproduce, but no longer ask, "Who am I?" or "What am I here for?" A silenced soul becomes the cost of stability. Maybe the most ironic part of dehumanization through hedonism is this. Everyone believes they're being themselves, but everyone is becoming the same. The system convinces us we're free, creative, authentic, while nudging us toward the same choices, the same tastes, the same lifestyles. Narcissism, once an individual flaw, becomes a shared way of life. Everyone stays busy, expressing themselves, showing themselves, fulfilling themselves. Yet the content of that expression grows more predictable. The self is celebrated, but it's a self built from catalogue parts. Huxley saw that a culture of standardized pleasure doesn't destroy individualism, it hollows it out. The person stays focused on themselves, but without depth, without real uniqueness. The result is collective loneliness. Everyone is connected, but nobody is truly present. Emotional conformity is the end of the human. What remains is a crowd of selves repeating themselves. Brave New World. Huxley's critique isn't only a warning, it's also an invitation. He calls us to recover our inner difference, to cultivate desires that weren't programmed, to allow emotions that aren't approved, to seek experiences that don't fit inside the display window of culture. To reclaim our humanity means breaking with standardized hedonism, finding silence again, accepting discomfort, returning to contemplation. It means wanting what isn't for sale, feeling what isn't validated, thinking what isn't popular. It means being a little abnormal in a world that only rewards conformity. Pain is a word we try to avoid. Everything in our culture teaches us to fear it, work around it, numb it. The pharmaceutical industry offers chemical relief. The entertainment industry offers psychological relief. And the logic of consumerism promises constant satisfaction, filling every empty space, or at least promising that it will. But Aldous Huxley gives us a warning that is as clear as it is uncomfortable. A society that eliminates pain is also eliminating the possibility of wisdom, virtue, and inner growth. In works like Brave New World and The Perennial Philosophy, Huxley shows that pain, even though it's uncomfortable, is essential if we want to become fully human. There is no maturity without suffering, no transcendence without crisis, no transformation without something breaking down. And every breakdown hurts. Pleasure makes us settle, pain wakes us up. The Perennial Philosophy. So a civilization that declares war on pain isn't just seeking comfort, it's stepping away from the deepest parts of the human condition. From Greek philosophy to Eastern spiritual traditions, pain has long been recognized as something that shapes the soul. Socrates accepted suffering as part of the search for truth. Buddha built his teaching on the understanding that life is dukkha, a kind of dissatisfaction and suffering that is built into existence. Christianity sees pain as a path of purification and redeeming love. Huxley, grounded in this perennial tradition, agrees with that view. He believes we only develop virtues like patience, compassion, courage, and humility by facing situations that break us, that push us up against our limits. Pain is the mirror that shows who we are and who we still aren't. Wisdom is born from the friction between what we want and what reality demands. The perennial philosophy. But the modern world, designed to avoid every kind of discomfort, is erasing that mirror. And with it, we lose contact with the depth that only pain can offer. In Brave New World, Huxley imagines a world where pain has almost been removed. There are no serious diseases, no unexpected losses, no unbearable frustrations. And when anything disturbing shows up, there's a solution. Soma, the perfect drug. No hangover, no obvious addiction, no confrontation with truth. It simply removes suffering from the experience, with a smile. And the result isn't a wise society, but an infantilized one. Citizens who are obedient, emotionally fragile, spiritually numb. The price of stability is the loss of depth. The price of non-stop happiness is the dissolving of the soul. Huxley saw this process already happening in his own time. And today it's even more obvious. Our society tries to eliminate every form of pain, emotional, physical, existential. Sadness becomes an illness. Loneliness becomes a failure. Doubt becomes a threat. We no longer learn how to move through pain. We only learn how to avoid it. The problem isn't feeling pain. The problem is never learning what it can teach us. The perennial philosophy. For Huxley, suffering isn't a mistake to be fixed. It's a message to be heard. He saw pain as a language of the soul, a deep kind of inner communication that reveals imbalance, misguided desires, and truths we don't want to see. When we remove pain as a legitimate part of life, modern culture silences that language. We stop asking, "What is this trying to tell me?" and only ask, "How do I make this stop?" We replace listening with the urgency to solve, and in doing that, we lose one of humanity's oldest and most powerful teachers. Pain knocks us off balance, but it also rebuilds us. It reminds us we aren't gods, that we are finite, that we need one another, that something in us has to change. Only those who have suffered can truly look at someone else with real compassion. A critical reading of Huxley. Without pain, there is no empathy, and without empathy, there is no real ethics, only shallow rules that exist as long as they don't cost us anything. Huxley insists that the search for happiness without pain is deep down a form of alienation. Joy that never faces tragedy, never looks into the abyss, never lives with limits, becomes shallow joy, calculated, conditioned, predictable pleasure. That manufactured happiness, distributed through soma, entertainment, and consumption, keeps human beings from becoming truly free. Because freedom requires responsibility, and responsibility means facing the pain of being who you are, carrying your choices, and grieving your losses. The happiness modern society offers is really an antidote to reality. And as Huxley suggests, the more we move away from what's real, the more we lose the chance to become real ourselves. Pain anchors us in reality. Without it, we float in a world of illusion and brave new world. The word crisis, from the Greek crisis, means decision, judgment. It's a breaking point that forces a choice. Huxley understands that the biggest human transformations are born in the ruptures created by pain. If you look at your own life, it's easy to see. The seasons of greatest growth weren't the easiest ones. They were the moments that forced you to rethink everything, to fall, to lose, to start again. Pain forces us to stop, to step out of autopilot, to search for deeper answers. Without it, we get trapped in a routine of pleasure, repetition, and escape. Without it, we don't transform, we only adapt. The soul wakes up in the fire of pain. That's where the whole human being is born. The perennial philosophy. Huxley isn't defending suffering for its own sake. He doesn't romanticize pain or argue that we should chase it. What he argues is that we need to restore meaning to suffering as part of the human journey, something to be welcomed, listened to, understood, not simply eliminated. For that, we have to rebuild a culture that gives pain a place, a culture that teaches people how to move through it, not just deny it. A culture where pain isn't taboo, but a territory of wisdom, where silence, grief, loneliness, and doubt aren't seen as disorders, but as sacred moments in the formation of the spirit. That culture once existed, in spiritual traditions, in ancient philosophy, in myths, in rites of passage. All of them carried a kind of education through suffering, a path for the soul to mature. Huxley calls us to remember that path. In a world that promises instant pleasure and total comfort, choosing to listen to pain is a revolutionary act. It's refusing anesthesia. It's saying, I want to live fully, even if it hurts. That choice reconnects us to what is most human: humility, fragility, tenderness, and above all, the wisdom that comes from impermanence. Because only those who accept that everything passes can truly live with presence. Only those who accept loss can learn how to love for real. When well-being becomes a new form of power, the tyranny of the future, Aldous Huxley said, won't look like the dictatorships of the past. There won't be visible concentration camps, violent censorship, or courts built on fear. It won't be necessary to crush freedom with weapons, because freedom will be traded voluntarily for something more tempting: comfort. In Brave New World Revisited, Huxley predicts with striking clarity one of the most sophisticated forms of domination: a politics of well-being, where control disguises itself as care, surveillance presents itself as efficiency, and obedience becomes voluntary, because it feels like pleasure. People won't love freedom, they'll love servitude, so long as it comes with comfort. Brave New World. This new model of power doesn't need repression. It manages sensations. It doesn't require ideological loyalty. It only needs to keep the population entertained, satisfied, and slightly numb. The result? Ethical criticism becomes harder, and domination becomes invisible. Unlike George Orwell, who imagined a future ruled by fear, 1984, Huxley describes a world where pleasure is the key to control. The goal isn't to rule through suffering, but through comfort that is regulated and distributed strategically. In this model, the state, or the system, doesn't need to crush rebellion. It simply makes rebellion feel unnecessary. After all, why fight? Why protest? Why question? If everything seems to be working perfectly, if we have food, entertainment, security, and instant access to whatever our immediate desires demand. That's the core of the politics of comfort, a system where well-being becomes the justification for any ethical compromise, where freedom gets traded for convenience, and where obedience is produced, not through force, but through the desire to keep things running smoothly. Modern power doesn't oppress, it organizes. It doesn't impose, it makes things easier. A critical reading of Huxley. In authoritarian regimes, ethical criticism is clear. There is injustice, censorship, persecution. Outrage rises because the evil is visible. But when evil shows up as management, as efficiency, as collective security, it becomes much harder to recognize and therefore much harder to resist. The politics of comfort empties moral conflict because it promises a life without friction, managed, stable, predictable. The individual becomes a consumer of solutions, not an ethical citizen. Their worries are no longer about truth or the common good, but about convenience, stability, performance. Meanwhile, the system creates an illusion of neutrality. Everything is technical, practical, for your own good. Domination becomes impersonal, scientific, rational, and therefore protected from criticism. The language of ethics gets replaced by the language of efficiency. It's no longer about whether something is good or just. It's enough to know whether it works. Brave New World. The politics of comfort turns the citizen into a customer. Their role stops being active participation in public life and becomes consuming services, demanding guarantees, complaining when the system fails, but taking responsibility for nothing beyond personal well-being. That shift is deep. An ethical citizen asks hard questions, gets involved, and accepts sacrifice for the collective. A citizen customer is trained to see society like an existential shopping mall. Everything must be available, fast, comfortable, including political solutions. This weakens democracy because power is judged not by principles, but by satisfaction scores. And when comfort is the main value, any dissenting voice, any criticism that causes discomfort, can be dismissed as negative, radical, or outdated. The citizen gives way to the consumer. Politics becomes a product. Ethics becomes an obstacle. A critical reading of Huxley. In Brave New World, books are replaced by visual entertainment. Philosophy becomes slogans. Art is domesticated. Religion turns into ritual with no transcendence. None of this happens through open censorship. It happens because people stop seeing any use in these things. Ethical criticism no longer needs to be banned. It becomes irrelevant. Who wants to think about social justice, spiritual freedom, sacrifice, virtue, when you can watch something enjoyable, order food on your phone, and go to sleep with a calm conscience because everything is working fine? That's the deeper danger of the politics of comfort. It makes the critical spirit obsolete. Philosophers become weird, dissidents become inconvenient, questioners become pessimists, and that's how the system protects itself from any real change. Pleasure can be the most effective form of censorship. Brave New World. The politics of comfort is also supported by technocracy, the rule of technique. Governments and corporations, in the name of improving life, make more and more decisions based on data, algorithms, and predictions. And so, the ethical debate gets displaced. We no longer argue about what is right, only about what is most efficient. Technology begins to mediate every part of life: work, relationships, spirituality, health, leisure, and with that comes a new kind of power, domination that is invisible, because the individual believes they are simply living well, when in reality they are being guided. Huxley wasn't anti-technology, he was against worshipping technology. He saw that when technique replaces ethics, society stops asking why and starts asking only how. And that's when soft totalitarianism settles in, not as a command, but as automatic routine. The great irony of this new form of domination is that freedom still exists, but it requires effort. Thinking critically, seeking real knowledge, resisting excessive comfort, practicing virtue, all of that is still possible. But it's no longer encouraged. It's pushed to the margins. And as Huxley predicted, most people won't give up comfort voluntarily. Freedom, when it feels like discomfort, demands a kind of courage that a pleasure-driven system doesn't cultivate. Freedom requires maturity, and maturity requires discomfort. The perennial philosophy. So the politics of comfort doesn't eliminate freedom. It simply makes freedom less attractive. And that's how it keeps itself alive, without violence, without censorship, without screaming, just with softness, convenience, efficiency, and a lightly numb smile. Imagine a prison built so well that its prisoners not only stopped wanting to leave, they actually love being there. A place where the chains aren't made of iron, but of dopamine, where the cage isn't enforced through violence, but offered through seduction. Aldous Huxley, deeply in tune with Plato's cave metaphor, warns us, when pleasure becomes absolute, it doesn't free you, it traps you. And the most dangerous part is that we walk into that trap willingly. The most effective kind of social control isn't the one that crushes people, but the one that seduces them. Brave New World. In Brave New World, Huxley describes a society where pleasure has been raised to the highest value. Pain is removed, introspection is pushed aside, and critical thinking is treated as unnecessary. Everything is easy, available, enjoyable. Sex without attachment, entertainment without silence, endless consumption. And for any discomfort that remains, there's soma, the perfect drug. No side effects, no guilt, no consequences. But as he shows us that perfection has a price, real freedom has been sacrificed. And the scariest part is that no one even misses it. In Plato's famous cave, we see prisoners chained since birth, forced to stare at shadows projected on a wall. Since they've never seen real light, they mistake shadows for reality. And when one prisoner is freed, he suffers. The light hurts, the truth is frightening. When he returns to free the others, he's rejected, because they prefer the safety of illusion. Huxley takes that metaphor and adds one crucial twist. In the modern cave, the chains aren't forced on us, we choose them. The shadows are pleasant, they're colourful, entertaining, and comforting. The prison doesn't feel like a prison because it gives the ego exactly what it wants: constant pleasure, escape from suffering, emotional simplicity. If the prison is comfortable enough, no one will want freedom. Brave New World revisited. So like Plato's prisoners, we start to fear the light. When truth shows up, it feels unpleasant. It demands effort, courage, silence, and sacrifice. And all of that clashes with the rule we've absorbed: pleasure above everything. According to Huxley, the hedonistic prison doesn't destroy consciousness, it dulls it. Instead of searching for truth, we chase sensations. Instead of facing reality, we pick emotional shortcuts. And the more pleasure we receive, the less we can tolerate the idea of losing it. We become partners in our own slavery. The most twisted part is that pleasure doesn't even have to be intense, just enough. Enough to keep us busy, distracted, comfortable enough to stop wanting anything else. And slowly, the soul forgets its deeper calling, the search for meaning, depth, and transcendence. People get used to very little as long as that little feels comfortable. A critical reading of Huxley. That's the trap. Shallow pleasure takes the place of fullness. Comfort takes the place of truth. The immediate takes the place of the eternal. And the modern person, surrounded by options, ends up living in a more sophisticated version of the cave, with Wi-Fi, HD screens, and guided meditation. Huxley saw with almost prophetic clarity how entertainment helps maintain this voluntary captivity. In Brave New World, feelies replace art. Novels are manufactured. Silence is avoided at all costs. There's no space for reflection, only stimulation. That criticism becomes even sharper when we look at the present. Social media, endless series, visual stimulation every second, constant notifications. We live surrounded by bright, attractive shadows. No one is forcing us to watch. We want to. And the more we consume, the harder it becomes to tolerate emptiness. Not the deep, existential kind, just the simple, everyday kind of being alone with yourself. Silence starts to feel like a problem. Introspection feels like a threat. Pain feels like failure. The modern cave is too comfortable to leave. Constant entertainment is the sweetest prison. Brave New World. Unlike classic dystopias, where oppression comes from the outside, Huxley shows us a new kind of domination. Voluntary. You don't have to imprison bodies. You just have to seduce minds. You don't have to ban books. You just have to make them boring compared to screens. You don't have to destroy thought. You just have to make pleasure the only value that matters. The result is a society where fewer and fewer people want the truth, because truth is uncomfortable, and discomfort becomes unbearable. We choose to stay in the shadows because the shadows feel safe, predictable, and warm. Plato said true education is turning the whole soul toward the light. But that takes effort. It requires leaving the cave. It requires giving up easy pleasures. Huxley suggests that the greatest tragedy of modern life isn't that we were imprisoned. It's that we chose to remain imprisoned. Perfect slavery is when the slave doesn't want freedom. Brave New World revisited. Real freedom, as Plato and Huxley both understood, involves suffering. Not suffering as punishment, but suffering as part of waking up. Light hurts the eyes. Truth bruises the ego. Inner growth challenges your pride. But that pain is what frees you. It separates you from the herd. It forces you to think. It reminds you there's something beyond the immediate. Huxley understood that pleasure by itself is never enough. It's part of life, but it can't be the point of life. A society built on absolute pleasure becomes a society of emotional teenagers, unable to handle frustration, unable to sit with mystery, unable to love without trying to possess. Freedom starts to feel heavy, and comfort becomes a prison. But not everything is lost. Plato reminds us it's always possible to leave the cave if someone looks up. And Huxley, even in his sharp criticism, wasn't a nihilist. He believed consciousness can wake up, that the human soul can rebel against shallow comfort, that inside each person there is a flame that won't be satisfied with shadows. That flame is the desire for meaning, the desire for authenticity, the desire for truth, even when it hurts. When we become willing to feel discomfort, to endure silence, to face pain, we begin to see the world differently. We begin to leave the cave. Real pleasure isn't escape. It's encounter, not illusion, but revelation, the perennial philosophy. Freeing yourself from a comfortable prison doesn't mean rejecting all pleasure. It means putting pleasure in its rightful place. Pleasure should be the fruit of a real life, not a replacement for it. It should express who you are, not function as a way to run from yourself. If you made it this far, it's because you feel, just like Huxley did, that there's something in the modern world that needs to be questioned. That comfort, pleasure, and the appearance of freedom aren't enough when they pull us away from truth, depth, and our own awareness. Thank you so much for staying with me through this philosophical deep dive to the very end. Your time, your attention, and your willingness to reflect are valuable. And that's exactly why this channel exists, to spark questions, awaken awareness, and build critical thinking in an age of superficiality. If this video connected with you in any way, don't forget to like it. This really helps get the message to more people. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, because here we're going to keep exploring Huxley, Plato, Nietzsche, Simone Weil, and so many others who still have a lot to teach us. Leave a comment below. Does pleasure set you free, or does it trap you? Your perspective might inspire someone else. And of course, share this video with someone you think needs this reflection today. Feel free to stay here on the channel. We've got more videos waiting for you, each one an invitation to awareness and inner freedom.